Hi, this is Matt Humke, Enterprise Director for Solimar International, and I'll be taking the next 10 minutes or so to introduce you to the Tourism Conservation Models and Strategies course content. The Tourism and Conservation course is really built upon two main resources that are mentioned here. One is Nature Conservancy's The Threshold of Sustainability for Tourism Within Protected Areas, a quick guide for protected area practitioners. This is a resource, as the name indicates, is a little bit more geared towards protected area managers and organizations and individuals that are working on issues like protected area management planning. The second document is Solimar's Tourism Conservation Models and Strategies. The second document has a somewhat broader scope that is, as we'll get into within this presentation, focuses a little bit more on not only protected areas but also the communities that live within them, the tourism industry, as well as those same local partners, protected areas and conservation organizations. It's also worth mentioning that many of the examples mentioned within this presentation, as well as within the case studies, are both focused on coastal and marine areas as well as sea turtles. This is because the development of this publication was funded through USAID Marea, which is a USAID funded project in Central America that is looking at specifically natural resource management and economic alternatives in coastal and marine areas in that region. So therefore, many of the examples here are marine and coastal based, and many of them are sea turtle tourism focused. But with that said, all of the principles upon which these conservation models and strategies are based apply equally to terrestrial ecosystems and other regions of the world. So it's just important to mention that's why there tends to be a little bit of a focus on not only coastal marine areas but also on sea turtle tourism. You might be asking yourself, why is Solimar, a sustainable tourism development firm, working on a conservation models and strategies document? Well, the reality is that the world that we live in and the stakeholders that we work with, both organizations like TNC and other local and international conservation organizations, as well as Solimar, often find themselves working with a number of stakeholders, including communities, including protected areas, including conservation organizations. So, as you might already be well aware of, the world of sustainable tourism doesn't allow you to ignore either the economic or the social or the environmental goals of what we do. Brett Jenks of RARE, an international conservation organization who has partnered with Solimar in the development of these models, is well known for saying that conservation isn't a biological challenge, it's an economic and social and political challenge, and that very much rings true as we start to look at these models and again the importance of those various stakeholders within it. The reason why Solimar invested time and effort into the development of these models is because really we feel like in the world of ecotourism, documented eco is really lacking. That there is, especially when it comes to community-based tourism, a huge lack of documented models in which tourism is directly supporting biodiversity conservation efforts. And as we as an organization started getting into exploring those challenges, we also found a number of wonderful opportunities and a number of great case studies, and therefore began looking at these models. Within the Solimar resource, it really tends to focus on, again, those two important players when we're talking about conservation in developing countries, and that's communities and protected areas. You look at the historical relationship between these two entities, and they're often one that is marked by conflict and a lack of cohesion and coordination. So really what we wanted to do within these models and strategies is identify opportunities where interests are aligned between communities and protected areas, and we really feel that tourism presents a number of unique opportunities but also challenges to align those interests. The development of the Solimar conservation models really began 5 or 6 years ago in partnership with RARE. And that process basically involved looking at a number of projects, both rares and later Solimars, as well as a number of conservation and development partners, as you see here, looking at their practical applications and really their lessons learned from the development application and sort of learning process from applying these conservation models and strategies. The end goal of this entire process from Solimar's perspective has been this desire to begin to develop specific and unique strategies and begin to develop and document the lessons learned that came from the application of those strategies. This is very much an organic process. Again, we feel like the sustainable tourism field is in a very nascent stage in terms of finding success in ways in which tourism can support conservation and link communities to conservation. So this is very much in the initial stages of its development. But with that said, the models presented here and the case studies that support them really do have a focus on practical application versus theoretical, sort of the theory behind it, which again we feel is more relevant to people who are in the field, practitioners attempting to make these linkages. Before we talk about the actual tourism conservation models and strategies themselves, it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about why tourism and conservation are often looked at as complementary strategies. Sustainable tourism, which encompasses ecotourism, cultural tourism, community-based tourism, at least within this definition, represents 20% of the global market, and it is the fastest growing segment within the global tourism market. This is especially true in developing countries, where 40% of all international tourism arrivals occur, of all forms of tourism. And tourism in developing countries represent 30% of global tourism receipts. So it's a particularly powerful potential economic growth approach, and as we're presenting here, a conservation approach in developing countries. Tourism as an industry presents some unique opportunities as well for conservation strategies. One is because it employs natural and cultural resources as working capital, and provides communities that often lack other forms of capital something to work with and to build businesses upon. Tourism also represents a tool for poverty reduction in areas where often no other alternatives exist. We are mostly working in areas that are isolated, protected areas, remote regions of countries, where resource extraction activities like illegal logging, overfishing, unsustainable agriculture are often the only economic options that exist for communities other than sustainable tourism. Sustainable tourism in communities. Again, the premise of most of these models and strategies that we'll go through today really fall on one central theory, and that is that tourism presents an opportunity for communities to depend upon the preservation of natural resources rather than their extraction. Sustainable tourism inherently depends upon the protection of forests, of wildlife, of cultural resources. That is the capital upon which sustainable tourism businesses are built. And so we look at it as an opportunity to develop those businesses and make those linkages to the communities that are dependent upon those resources, to encourage their advocacy and participation in conservation. The other central theme that we find within all these models and strategies is that again, they present opportunities to build mutually beneficial relationships between communities and protected areas, and that is something that historically has been hard to achieve. As an introduction to the tourism and conservation models, here we see the 6 overarching models themselves. Within these 6 models, there are 16 unique strategies, which I'll get into within this presentation. So I'm just going to sort of briefly touch on these. But within these models, we see an increasingly complex relationship in terms of their design and their implementation, based on really the resources that are required to achieve these conservation models, as well as the stakeholders that are involved and need to be on the same page for them to be successful. But to just briefly run through them, the first model is really focused on improving tourism operations and guidelines. This is really just the idea that sustainable tourism represents economic activity that at least tries to mitigate its environmental impact, and specifically, obviously, here we're talking about tourism activities. The second model is focused on increasing conservation awareness in constituencies. The essence of this is it attempts to increase the conservation awareness of both local residents as well as visitors. That's very important, as well as the number of local residents that are financially benefiting from sustainable tourism. And we'll get into some models of that represent those linkages. The third model is focused on increasing income diversification. This is one of the older models within sort of the tourism world, the idea that you can take an illegal hunter and turn him into a nature guide. There are some complexities to that model, and there are some things that are challenging within that. But it's really the idea that you can create sustainable tourism jobs, particularly for people that are involved with or dependent upon resource extraction, things like hunting, overfishing, unsustainable agriculture. The fourth model is increasing monitoring and research. This has got some really interesting strategies, some opportunities to increase monitoring and research through the presence of trained guides, of visitors and tourism groups, or other researchers, for example, save tourism, in critical natural areas threatened by illegal and extractive activities. The fifth model is focused on essentially increasing the money that's generated by tourism that's available to support conservation. That's both through things like tourism profits, as well as things like donations and even taxes. And then the final model is focused on increasing conservation partnerships. I think this is one of the more interesting and obviously one of the more complex models. But again, this is really exploring those unique linkages that exist and opportunities between protected areas, communities, and nonprofits working to support conservation in parks and protected areas around the world. This next slide represents another common thread that we think runs within all of these models and strategies, and that is essentially the two resources that successful tourism can generate to support conservation. The first resource is money. This can be money from local beneficiaries, such as communities and the community businesses that are supported through sustainable tourism, as well as visitors themselves. And I'm going to talk a little bit about specifics there. The other resource is time. And again, same two groups. Time from the local beneficiaries, in other words, the communities themselves, as well as, again, visitors. So looking at this graph from left to right, on the left in green, we see the path that money can support, how money can support conservation strategies. On the very far left, we see the community contributions of money that comes from successful tourism enterprises in parks and protected areas. Can include everything from percentage of year-end profits of enterprises to money generated specifically from the sale of certain products like conservation-themed merchandise, as well as mandatory costs such as conservation taxes. These are all cost layers and revenue that can be generated by a tourism enterprise itself and the products that it's selling. Again, if you follow the linkages down, all of those things generate money that can create enterprise financial support that can lead into conservation strategies. The next column over with visitors, again, looking at money specifically, these models and strategies talk about how to harness the interest of visitors that are characteristic of the sustainable tourism market segments to support the places that they're visiting, primarily through the development of travel philanthropy programs. So within these models and strategies, we talk a little bit about success stories and challenges and lessons learned from developing travel philanthropy programs. On the right side in blue, on the very far right, we see time. The first being community counterpart. This is really, again, the time of communities, the people that are benefiting from the existence and development of sustainable tourism enterprises, that those local beneficiaries can contribute to actual conservation activities and strategies, community-based strategies. These contributions of time include supporting things like monitoring and research activities, environmental education programs in local communities, and all of that flows into local support, the building of local constituencies to support conservation, which is a very exciting opportunity and a very exciting sort of development for the world of community-based conservation. And then sliding over to the left a little bit, the last column, visitor counterpart time. Again, this is harnessing the interest and investment of visitors to the places, the destinations that they're going, particularly in the sustainable tourism niche, to support things like volunteer programs to contribute their time to conservation through volunteer programs, as well as through the sale of saved tours. Within the Solimar Tourism Conservation Models document, we talk a little bit about conservation threat assessment as well. Because before you can design a conservation strategy supported through tourism, you need to know essentially what you're trying to address with that strategy. And most of the strategies presented within the Solimar document tend to focus on anthropomorphic factors, human-based factors that we often see within parks and protected areas that come from the communities themselves. Again, things like illegal hunting, illegal logging, overfishing, unsustainable agriculture. There is a process that is touched on within the conservation models and strategies course that simply explains the process of assessing conservation threats. And in essence, it really involves first starting with the target condition, which is the green box you see on the right, which is really, what are you trying to protect in the first place? It might be a certain park, it might be a certain species, it might be an entire ecosystem, but it involves first defining what is your conservation target. The second step is to take one step back. Here we see in the middle box to the left of the target condition, and that's to identify the direct threats to that target condition. These are factors that directly impact the biodiversity of the target condition. The next step in the conservation threat assessment is to take one step removed from that and to look at those underlying conditions that result in that direct threat. And here we're really talking about indirect threats, which is a social, economic, political factor that results in the direct threat. And to walk you through a specific example of how this works, let's say, for example, we're looking at protecting sea turtle eggs in a protected area on the coast of Nicaragua. Well, based on a conservation threat assessment, which usually involves a workshop with a number of stakeholders, everybody from protected area managers to community leaders to conservation organizations to maybe even tourism, private sector representatives, you talk about essentially what are the direct threats that are affecting that target condition. And in our example, the primary direct threat to sea turtle eggs or sea turtle nests is sea turtle poaching, which is essentially the extraction, often by local residents, of sea turtle eggs for consumption or for sale. Well, that is a direct threat, but what are the underlying conditions or the indirect threats that we're trying to address that results in sea turtle egg poaching? Well, in this example, the conservation threat assessment process revealed that customs and traditions were simply sort of generations of doing this have resulted in sea turtle poaching. A lack of conservation awareness in local residents might be an indirect threat, simply not knowing the importance, the life cycle of sea turtles, their level of being threatened at a global level. Those are all examples of a lack of conservation awareness. And finally, a lack of local alternatives. Often we find that communities simply don't have anything else to do to feed their families and put food on their table than to engage in resource extraction. So these all present indirect, underlying, human-based causes for the direct threat. And as you can see, and as we'll start to see within the strategies, that this really gives us the information that's critical to start to identify the models and strategies that can address those underlying indirect threats. Because again, it's often a social, economic, or political factor that can be addressed through successful sustainable tourism development. Okay, so here we are on the first model. So there's one slide for each of the 6 models, which I'll move through to wrap this up. The first model, like I said, was improving tourism operations guidelines. Summary of this is it's about developing and adopting sustainable operating principles and practices that lessen tourism's negative impact on species and habitat. Again, this is sort of doing at least the important step of mitigating tourism's impact to the environment. This is not quite yet where you're proactively supporting conservation, but an important some important basic steps that businesses and the tourism industry overall can take to reduce its impact on the environment. So the strategies within this are 2. The first is improving and disseminating visitor codes of conduct. So within this strategy, we talk about things like using signage to communicate codes of conduct, the importance of having codes of conduct in the first place, utilizing other mediums to communicate codes of conduct to visitors, through things like guides and other forms of interpretation. The second model is really focused on the industry itself, so improving and disseminating tourism operation guidelines. Again, this is looking for opportunities to develop and to implement guidelines, best practices, criteria with the industry itself. Another aspect of this particular strategy is we present within the strategy, within the document, a number of really unique, creative ways that protected areas around the world are using social media and other forms of online marketing to sort of reach out to visitors, to both sort of welcome them and attract people to those places, as well as communicate those important sort of codes of conduct and guidelines for both visitors as well as the industry when people and operators and dive shops and so forth visit and take advantage of those natural and cultural resources. The second model is focused on increasing environmental awareness and conservation constituencies. This is focused not only on local residents, as you can see here in the summary, but also on visitors themselves, and trying to take that awareness and turn it into some degree of environmental activism. So the first strategy is focused on increasing the awareness and conservation support of visitors. This talks a lot about ways and the importance that sustainable tourism enterprises and the guides that work within them can be instruments to interpret the importance of the protected areas where these businesses exist, and to encourage, develop the appreciation of visitors to those places, which sort of builds the platform to eventually sort of ask for their support, whether it's financial or through their contribution of time to support those conservation activities. The second strategy is focused on increasing the awareness and conservation support of local residents. Again, this looks at taking the opportunity of having those trained guides who have been trained in environmental interpretation and natural and cultural resources of a particular destination, and using them to support environmental education efforts in local communities. This strategy also talks on other techniques to build local conservation support, things like environmental festivals, using interpretive centers and displays to increase awareness and support of local residents. And then the third strategy is focused on linking the benefits of sustainable tourism to the community as a whole to create those conservation constituencies. This strategy comes from the reality that there are limitations to the number of jobs that can be generated by a small tourism enterprise, and therefore there are ways to take the revenue and the profits that are generated by enterprises to somehow meet the needs of communities as a whole. So this strategy talks about things like using tourism revenues to support the building or the improvement of healthcare facilities, of schools, even things like soccer fields. So it's really finding ways that tourism can support the community, and the importance of making linkages between the communities that are benefiting from tourism and their role in protecting the resources upon which that tourism depends. The third model is focused on increasing income diversification. This is really focused on creating sustainable tourism jobs for local community members that are inherently dependent upon natural resource protection. There are usually in communities that live within protected areas and parks a number of individuals that are somehow involved in resource extraction for all those different activities I've already mentioned: hunting, farming, fishing. Within tourism, there's a great opportunity to target those individuals with sustainable tourism employment. In particular, there's a number of models that have shown, or excuse me, there are a number of case studies that have shown that poachers, for example, who have spent their lives growing up in protected areas hunting sea turtles or other species, possess all of this incredible knowledge of those places. And by simply giving them some new tools, whether it's language or interpretation or guiding skills, all of that knowledge that they possess translates really well into working within the tourism industry. The second strategy within this model is focused on developing tourism products that directly mitigate a conservation threat. A really neat example of this is a project that Widecast, a conservation organization that works throughout the Caribbean, is doing, where they take plastic bags that are one of the primary conservation threats to sea turtles because they think it's jellyfish and they eat the plastic bags. The organization is teaching local women's group to collect those bags and to actually use the bags to create arts and crafts products like handbags made from those very same plastic bags. So this strategy talks a lot about that type of opportunity to take a threat like plastic bags and turn it into an actual conservation product that generates revenue and creates jobs. The fourth tourism conservation model is focused on increasing monitoring and research. And reading the summary, that's increasing the monitoring and research presence of trained guides, visitors, and or researchers in critical natural areas threatened by illegal or extractive activities. Sustainable tourism, and particularly SAVE tourism, which is scientific, academic, volunteer, and educational tourism, presents this great opportunity to develop tourism products and experiences that allow visitors to participate in the monitoring and research activities that are going on at the site. It's an extremely attractive tourism product, and it also, whether it's monitoring or research, can help support monitoring or research activities. And this is a trend that Solimar is increasingly looking at, that by working with protected areas, by working with conservation organizations that are interested in increasing the monitoring and the research that's going on in those protected areas, as well as the protected area managers themselves feel very much the same way often, because they are often underfunded and understaffed when it comes to monitoring and enforcement and research, that there's a great opportunity to develop monitoring and research activities that are part of tourism enterprises and are part of the tourism products that they're selling. The fifth conservation model is focused on increasing tourism-generated conservation financing. And this is really focused on harnessing the power of money, which is what many people think of when they think about what tourism can generate to support conservation activities. The first strategy that is presented to achieve this is utilizing tourism profits to support conservation activities. This can really occur within any kind of tourism enterprise, but within the strategies we focus on community-based tourism enterprises. But it presents ways in which practitioners and developers of sustainable tourism can work with communities to first recognize the importance of their financial support of conservation activities. Again, based on that inherent dependency that their products have on the protection of those natural and cultural resources that exist at their site, as well as sort of the mechanics of how to work with communities to plan for and to set aside that kind of funding from their year-end profits through things like profit-sharing strategies and developing memorandums of understanding with those communities going into the business planning and the project development stages. The second strategy is tapping more into sort of visitors, and again within the sustainable tourism industry, that common desire to support the protection of places that travelers visit through travel philanthropy programs. So that presents some of the mechanics of that approach, as well as examples from case studies. And then the third model is looking at creating additional sources of revenue that can be developed with the intention of directly supporting conservation costs. The examples that are presented within this part of the strategy are really focused on conservation-themed merchandise. So how to build a conservation brand for merchandise, how to communicate that to consumers through hang tags and through marketing messages, as well as the different types of products that often appeal to visitors in that vein of conservation-themed merchandise. The sixth and final conservation model is focusing on using tourism to increase conservation partnerships. As I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, the historical relationship between protected areas and communities has often been one of conflict. Protected areas view communities often as a nuisance. They cut down the forest, they hunt illegally, they fish and farm, and they see that as a group that needs policing. Communities look at protected areas and often see them and their managers as people who make and enforce rules that impede their ability to make a living. With tourism, we see an opportunity to align interests because at the end of the day, both entities are focused on the conservation of natural and cultural resources at the destination or in a protected area. So it's really these strategies focus on how to approach and open up the dialogue between these various stakeholders, which also includes NGOs and universities when we get into products like Save Tourism products and Save Tourism market. And it really explores the various roles that these various organizations and institutions, scientific NGOs, protected areas communities, and the visitors themselves, that they all play in developing these tourism conservation strategies that align these interests. And finally, within the annex of the tourism conservation models, there are a number of case studies, really actually one case study for each of the 16 strategies that are presented within the six conservation models. Again, the focus of these strategies has been Latin America, particularly Central America, particularly coastal marine areas. But the lessons learned and the processes that they went through and that they describe within these case studies really do represent activities and opportunities that apply as easily to terrestrial ecosystems as well as they do to marine ecosystems. So here we have a number of the case studies listed that capture each of these strategies. So thank you very much. I look forward to your participation in the full course and have a great day.